Tonight, we're starting with something quietly unsettling. Not a monster, not a conspiracy, but a medieval way of thinking that still controls your daily life. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy spending your nights here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always interesting to see how wide the night really stretches. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that steady background hum, and let's drift gently into tonight's strange, slightly ridiculous journey. The workday you never escaped. Most people assume the modern work schedule came from factories, machines, and industrial efficiency, from serious men in suits deciding how long humans could work before collapsing. But the truth is much older and much stranger. The modern workday didn't come from factories, it came from monasteries. In the Middle Ages, monks were among the only people organized enough to measure time precisely. Their entire existence revolved around bells. Bells to wake, bells to pray, bells to eat, bells to sleep, bells reminding them they had chosen this life. The day was divided into rigid segments called canonical hours. At each one, monks stopped whatever they were doing, farming, copying manuscripts, staring into nothingness, and followed orders from the bell tower. It wasn't about productivity, it was about obedience. Over time, towns adopted this system. Markets opened by bells, work began by bells, life synchronized itself to sound. When factories appeared centuries later, they simply copied the model. Same structure, same rigid hours, just fewer prayers and more shouting. The monks at least got silence and wine. You got fluorescent lighting and emails labeled urgent. So when your alarm goes off tomorrow morning, remember you're not living a modern system, you're following a medieval routine that escaped a monastery and learned corporate language. Why we still say, "Bless you." When someone sneezes, most of us respond automatically, "Bless you." It feels polite, harmless, normal. But it began as panic. In medieval Europe, a sneeze wasn't mild, it was terrifying. Plagues moved fast, symptoms came suddenly, and sneezing was seen as a warning sign that death might be approaching. There was also a belief that sneezing loosened the soul, briefly separating it from the body, which, according to medieval logic, gave dark forces an opening. In the 6th century, church leaders encouraged people to respond with a blessing, not as courtesy, but as protection. Each "bless you" was a tiny emergency prayer, a reflex meant to block disaster. Centuries passed, medicine improved, science advanced, but the habit stayed. Today, no one believes your soul is escaping through your nose, but we still feel uncomfortable when a sneeze goes unacknowledged. It's medieval fear wearing modern manners. When the fork was evil. The fork seems harmless, unremarkable, boring. But when it first appeared in Western Europe, it caused outrage. Early forks arrived through wealthy Eastern nobles, small decorative tools used to avoid touching food directly. To the medieval church, this was offensive. God gave humans hands. Using metal instead was seen as prideful, unnatural. When a noblewoman died shortly after using forks publicly, priests claimed it as proof of divine punishment. The message was clear: eat with your fingers or accept the consequences. For hundreds of years, people avoided forks entirely. Illness from unwashed hands was common, but religious logic overruled hygiene. Only when fashion made forks respectable did society accept them. So every time you eat with cutlery, you're participating in a quiet rebellion that medieval authority lost. The original bachelor party. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic, it was contractual. Still, men found time to panic about it. Before weddings, groups of men gathered to drink excessively, gamble irresponsibly, and celebrate their final hours of theoretical freedom. These gatherings were loud, dangerous, and often involved weapons. The church condemned them, which only made them more appealing. The tradition survived because it served a purpose, one last moment of chaos before responsibility closed in. Modern bachelor parties are the same ritual, just with fewer swords and far more digital evidence. Why we wear black to funerals. Grief hasn't always had a color. Ancient cultures often wore white, symbolizing purity and release, but medieval Europe chose black. Not because it was symbolic, because it was expensive. Only the wealthy could afford deep black dyes, turning mourning into a display of status. Grief became theatrical, public, fashionable. The church embraced it. Black suggested humility, seriousness, devotion. Eventually, everyone followed. Today, we dress in black because tradition says so, not because it means anything anymore. It's grief by dress code. The handshake's real purpose. The handshake didn't begin as friendliness, it began as a safety check. In medieval Europe, people were armed, encounters were tense, trust was rare. Extending your right hand showed you weren't holding a weapon. The movement confirmed nothing was hidden. It meant, I could hurt you, but I won't, for now. Centuries later, the gesture survived. It became professional, polite, but its meaning never fully changed. The handshake is still a cautious agreement disguised as warmth. Table manners were survival rules. Medieval dining was unpleasant. People shared bowls, shared knives, used fingers constantly. Napkins didn't exist. Food spread disease easily, so rules emerged, not for elegance, but survival. Don't spit, don't lick blades, don't chew openly. What we call good manners today began as attempts not to die during dinner. Outro. So much of what we call modern life is just medieval logic that never got updated. Schedules, manners, greetings, rituals. They linger quietly, shaping behavior long before their original fears disappeared. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, just remember, you're not as modern as you think. You're medieval with better lighting. Good night. Books began appearing in medieval Europe that did something revolutionary. They explained how to behave like a human being. These manuals weren't poetic or philosophical. They were painfully specific. They warned readers not to scratch themselves while eating, not to blow their nose into the table linen, not to use a knife to inspect their teeth. Which tells us something uncomfortable. None of this was obvious yet. Manners didn't exist because people were refined. They existed because people were feral. Very quickly, the upper classes realized something powerful. Cleanliness could be weaponized. Peasants ate however they needed to survive. Nobles ate slowly, carefully, and with rules. Rules designed to exclude anyone who hadn't been trained since childhood. Table manners became a silent competition, a social duel fought with spoons instead of swords. Eventually, behavior turned moral. The church decided that proper dining reflected inner purity. A clean table meant a clean soul. Which is ironic, considering medieval Europe also believed illness came from bad air, witches, and occasionally red hair. By the Renaissance, eating was no longer about nourishment, it was theater. Banquets were performances meant to prove you weren't an animal pretending to be rich. It was social media before electricity. Everyone watching, judging, remembering. And those rules never left. Don't burp, don't pick, don't shout. You follow them instinctively, not because they're logical, but because once upon a time, breaking them could get you labeled dangerous or diseased. The weekend that wasn't kindness. Most people assume the weekend is a modern gift, won through unions, science, or compassionate employers. It isn't. It began as a medieval loophole. In the Middle Ages, there was no weekend. Work didn't stop unless something forced it to. That something was the church. Religious calendars were packed with holy days, dozens every year. Saints, feasts, miracles nobody remembers anymore. Each one meant no work, free food, and public drinking before noon. Landowners hated it. One medieval bishop complains that peasants worked one day and rested 3, the earliest known complaint about productivity. Later, religious reformers decided people were enjoying rest far too much. They eliminated most feast days and narrowed rest to one official day, Sunday. Not for recovery, for attendance. Skipping work wasn't illegal, it was sinful. When factories arrived centuries later, owners noticed something inconvenient. Exhausted workers broke machines and themselves. So rest days returned, reluctantly. Saturday afternoons were added when someone realized fewer crushed limbs improved profits. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend became standard. 1 day for God, 1 day for recovery. The weekend wasn't kindness, it was compromise. Between religion, survival, and capitalism needing you functional again by Monday. The wedding ring that was a receipt. When you slide on a wedding ring, it feels romantic, timeless, meaningful. Historically, it wasn't. Marriage in the Middle Ages was paperwork with costumes. Love was optional. The ring wasn't a promise, it was proof. Ancient cultures used circular bands to symbolize eternity. The Romans turned them into ownership markers. Medieval Europe turned them into church-approved contracts. The ring was placed on a specific finger because people believed a vein ran straight to the heart. This vein does not exist. Medieval science also blamed headaches on demons. For centuries, only women wore rings. It marked possession, not partnership. Men began wearing them much later, mostly during wars, as reminders, signals, or warnings to others. Today, the ring claims to represent devotion until it's forgotten on a sink. What survives isn't romance, it's branding, a medieval agreement polished into sentiment. Curtains and the invention of privacy. Medieval homes didn't have rooms, they had space. Families, animals, and strangers shared it. Privacy wasn't expected, it was accidental. Then fabric changed everything. Curtains began as protection from cold and insects, but quickly became symbols. Nobles hung heavy drapes around beds, not just for warmth, but dignity. A bed with curtains meant status. They created the illusion of privacy in halls filled with servants, relatives, and spectators, sometimes even from one's own spouse. Peasants copied the idea with blankets and scraps. Hanging fabric felt like wealth. Over time, privacy became aspirational. Curtains spread to windows, walls, and doorways.
and today you still draw them instinctively, as if someone might be watching. The paranoia remains, the fabric just improved. God Save the King wasn't pride. When people shouted, "God save the king," in the Middle Ages, it wasn't patriotism, it was damage control. Kings were believed to be chosen by God, but constantly threatened by evil forces, plague, rebellion, other kings. Public prayers weren't celebration, they were protection. Crowds believed that repeating the phrase loudly enough might prevent catastrophe, and spiritual alarm system. It didn't work. Kings died anyway. But refusing to say it looked suspicious, and suspicion was dangerous. Over time, the phrase became ceremonial, then musical, then national. What began as "please don't let the devil kill our ruler" became a stadium anthem, a medieval panic ritual, now televised. The day of rest was never about you. A day of rest sounds compassionate. It wasn't. Sunday existed so people would show up to church, not because they deserved rest, but because priests needed attendance. Working on Sunday wasn't laziness, it was blasphemy. Stories circulated of divine punishment, tools breaking, people dying, animals misbehaving. God apparently monitored weekend activities closely. Rules applied unevenly. The wealthy worked when needed, the poor feared hell. Centuries later, the idea was rebranded as family time, then personal time. Now it's anxiety time, laundry, errands, and thinking about Monday. You're still resting because someone older, louder, and holier decided it was acceptable.
And still the faithful kept giving. Coins dropped into boxes, gold flowed into Rome, all in the belief that the Pope stood as the moral axis of the world. Rome itself was less convinced. When a new Pope was chosen, the crowd didn't speculate about holiness. They speculated about habits, who his companions might be, how extravagant his tastes were likely to become. The Church had transformed into a grand performance. Sin dressed in silk, ambition masked by incense. Behind every sacred decree pulsed something deeply human: desire, ego, hunger. If popes ruled the stage, then Rome's courtesans ruled the backstage. The women who ran Rome without a throne. These weren't street figures lurking in shadows. They were elite, educated, and dangerous. They were called honest courtesans, a phrase that made sense only in Renaissance Rome. They spoke Latin, quoted poetry, argued theology, and wore gowns worth more than a bishop's conscience. One of the most famous was known simply as Imperia. Her name alone commanded rooms. Statesmen, artists, and clergy passed through her salons, drawn as much by her intellect as her beauty. She could dismantle a moral argument while refilling a wine glass, and men left convinced they lost something important, usually money, dignity, or political advantage. When she died, the city mourned. Flowers arrived quietly from places that officially disapproved of her existence. Another was Tullia, a writer and philosopher who dared to suggest that pleasure wasn't a sin reserved for men alone. Her essays unsettled priests more effectively than her reputation ever could. These women understood Rome better than anyone. They knew secrets whispered in confessionals. They knew which promises were lies and which were leverage. A well-placed sentence from the right courtesan could end a career or begin a war. In a city where men preached virtue and practiced indulgence, these women mastered the art of influence. Power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore silk. Noble women and private rebellions. While courtesans moved freely, noble women lived under constant scrutiny. Marriage for them was strategy, not affection.
a union of land, alliances, and expectations. When passion found no place in public life, it moved underground. Letters were written carefully, meetings disguised as pilgrimages, confessors chosen for discretion rather than morality. Some women became famous for restraint and piety. Their private correspondence suggested something more complicated. Poems blurred the line between devotion and desire. Friendships raised eyebrows. Silence did the rest. Others were bolder. Salons became gathering places where music and philosophy provided cover for flirtation. Portraits hid messages. Saints' images concealed folded notes. The risk was real. A man's indiscretion could be forgiven. A woman's could destroy her. So they learned balance, public purity, private fire. They confessed often, dressed modestly, and lived carefully wicked lives. In Rome, women learned that survival meant subtlety, and subtlety could be powerful. Art, holiness with a body. If Rome needed a respectable excuse for desire, it found one in art. Painters were paid to glorify heaven. They chose to glorify flesh as well. The human body returned to center stage, sculpted and painted with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Madonnas looked suspiciously real. Saints carried the weight of muscle and breath. One celebrated artist painted serenity by day and chased pleasure by night. Another agonized over guilt while carving perfection from stone. Some defended it as divine beauty, others whispered blasphemy. And then there were those who refused to separate holiness from humanity at all. They painted saints with the faces of sinners, martyrs with the expressions of lovers. The church paid for it, then complained. Rome's chapels filled with bodies that reminded worshippers of everything they were told to resist. Art became temptation, framed in gold. Carnival. Rome removes its masks. If you wanted to see Rome without pretense, you waited for Carnival. For a few days each year, the city abandoned restraint. Masks erased rank. Wine replaced sermons. Rules dissolved into music and movement. Priests mingled with crowds. Nobles danced with strangers. Everyone pretended not to recognize anyone. The church tolerated it, sometimes even observed from a safe distance. Confessionals overflowed afterwards, priests listening patiently while committing half the stories to memory. Secrets didn't last long in Rome. Rumors traveled faster than repentance. Carnival ended, incense returned, faces were scrubbed clean, but the city remembered. Virtue resumed its performance, pleasure retreated into shadow. Until next year. The family that made sin official. No story of Rome's excess is complete without the family who turned indulgence into policy. The Borgias didn't invent corruption, they professionalized it. Their patriarch rose to the papacy with charm, strategy, and remarkable flexibility in matters of virtue. The Vatican became a center of luxury. Feasts blurred into spectacle. Appointments followed money rather than merit. His children became symbols of power unchecked. One ruled through charm and violence, another through rumor, intelligence, and fear. Enemies exaggerated their sins, supporters excused them. Rome watched, fascinated. The papacy became less a spiritual office and more a dynasty. When that reign finally ended, the city exhaled, relieved, disturbed, and quietly impressed. Forgiveness for sale. For all its sermons, the church wasn't merely surrounded by sin, it monetized it. Confession offered relief, donations ensured speed. You could fail spectacularly, confess convincingly, and leave spiritually spotless, so long as you paid. Sin became renewable, forgiveness reliable. Coins clinked louder than conscience. Even critics noticed. Even believers began to smile knowingly during sermons about restraint. Reformers whispered, some shouted, most were silenced. The irony was impossible to miss. A church built to save souls had become very good at selling absolution. And Rome, eternal, indulgent Rome, understood the arrangement perfectly. Sin was human, forgiveness was affordable, and faith, like everything else, had a price.
Death didn't frighten you anymore. It sharpened you. The circus had a way of burning fear out of a man. Once you'd heard the crowd roar your name, once you'd felt the chariot lift beneath you like a living thing, ordinary terror felt small. By the third lap, the weaker drivers were already gone. A broken axle near the spina sent one chariot cartwheeling into the sand. The horses kept running. The man didn't. The crowd gasped, then cheered. Rome never mourned during a race. There would be time for prayers later. You leaned low, muscles screaming, lungs burning as dust coated your teeth. The reins bit into your waist, every jolt threatening to drag you beneath the wheels. You remembered the knife hidden in your belt, not for fighting, but for mercy. If you fell, you were expected to cut yourself free before the horses finished the job. This was the unspoken contract of the circus. 4 laps remained. The greens surged ahead, their lead driver grinning beneath his helmet, confident, careless. Confidence was dangerous. It widened turns. It dulled instinct. You waited. The Circus Maximus rewarded patience the way the sea rewards sailors, rarely but decisively. At the turning post, you pushed your team closer than seemed possible, wheels screaming inches from stone. The crowd screamed with them. Your rival misjudged the turn. Wood cracked, metal shrieked, a chariot shattered like kindling. The greens howled in fury as their champion disappeared beneath hooves and dust. You didn't look back. By the final lap, there were only 3 of you left. The crowd was no longer shouting factions. They were shouting names. Yours was among them. That was when you understood the real power of the circus. It wasn't speed, it wasn't strength, it was attention. For these few minutes, Rome forgot its gods, its laws, its wars. It watched you instead. You crossed the finish line first. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the stunned intake of breath before reality returned. Then the city exploded. Wreaths flew, coins rained down. Your name rolled across the stone seats like thunder. You had entered the circus as property. You left it as something else. Not free, not yet, but famous. And fame in Rome was its own kind of freedom. Victorious charioteers earned more than money. They earned protection, patrons, statues carved before they were dead. Some bought their freedom. Others bought revenge. Many bought themselves straight into an early grave, drowning in wine, lovers, and wagers they could no longer refuse. The circus lifted men up quickly. It dropped them faster. You survived long enough to learn the final truth. Rome did not love its heroes, it consumed them. The same crowd that crowned you today would cheer your death tomorrow if it entertained them more. Applause was loyalty with a short memory. Still, when night fell and the stables grew quiet, you lay awake listening to the horses breathe and thought the same dangerous thought every charioteer did. Just one more race, one more victory, one more moment where the world held its breath for you. Because in Rome,
Immortality didn't come from virtue or holiness. It came from being unforgettable. And if that meant risking everything, body, soul, and name, then so be it. The circus had taught you the lesson Rome always taught best. Life was short, glory was loud, and the crowd was always hungry. Everything slowed. The roar of the crowd fell away, stretched thin like a distant echo underwater. The horses surged forward without you, their power suddenly unmoored, while the chariot beneath your feet betrayed you with a final, delicate crack. You knew the sound, wood giving up. The axle snapped, clean and final, and the world tilted sideways. For a suspended moment, you were weightless, not falling, not flying, just hanging between glory and ruin. You saw the sand rushing up like a pale sea. You smelled iron, dust, and fear. You felt the reins bite harder into your waist, tightening like a judgment. Instinct screamed what training had drilled into you since boyhood. Cut free. Your hand went to the knife, but pride hesitated. You thought of the crowd, of the statues, of the name carved in stone and shouted by strangers who had never known your face, only your speed. The chariot collapsed. You were thrown forward, body slamming into the track as hooves thundered past inches from your skull. Pain exploded white and immediate, sharp enough to erase thought. The reins dragged you, scraping flesh from bone, the sand tearing at you like teeth. Somewhere above, Rome inhaled. Then you found the blade. Steel flashed, the leather parted, and suddenly you were free, rolling, tumbling, broken, but alive. The horses vanished into noise and chaos. Another chariot smashed into the wreckage. Someone screamed your name. Someone else screamed for blood. You lay still. The sand was warm beneath your cheek. It smelled the same as it had on your first day. Dust, sweat, inevitability. Slowly, carefully, you breathed. The crowd roared again, disappointed, triumphant, confused. They never agreed on anything except volume. Attendants rushed in, waving red cloths, dragging what could be dragged, covering what could not. A medic knelt beside you, hands hovering, afraid to touch a man who might already belong to the gods. You opened your eyes. The sky above the Circus Maximus was impossibly blue. Not marble, not banners, just sky. They carried you off the track like a relic, half broken, half sacred. As you passed beneath the stands, the crowd leaned forward, searching your face for an ending worthy of the story. You gave them none. You lived. That was the final insult. Survival was never as satisfying as death in Rome. Your body healed slowly. Scars mapped your skin like old roads. Your hands never fully stopped shaking. The reins, once an extension of your will, became something you no longer trusted. You never raced again. Statues were still raised, not of victory, but of endurance. Poets rewrote the ending to suit themselves. Some said you retired by choice. Others swore the gods had spared you for reasons no mortal could understand. You let them talk. At night, you dreamed of wheels screaming and hooves pounding, of the moment before the crash when everything was perfect and terrible and alive. You woke with your heart racing, fingers curled as if still gripping the reins. Rome moved on, as it always did. New champions rose, new bodies broke, The crowd learned new names and forgot the old ones. But sometimes in taverns near the circus, when wine flowed and the stories grew louder, someone would point to you and whisper, "That one, he outran death." And for a city built on spectacle and sacrifice, that was enough. Because in Rome, immortality didn't belong only to the dead. It belonged to those who gave the crowd a story it could never finish telling.
Over time, this mastery of water reshaped the Egyptian mind itself. When a people learned to measure floods, they learned to measure everything. Justice, balance, duty, all came to be understood as forms of alignment, not absolutes, but proportions. This was Ma'at, not merely law, not merely morality, but equilibrium. The belief that the universe functioned only when every force stayed in balance, like the Nile held between flood and drought. Too much and life drowned, too little and it withered. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was the keeper of that balance. His greatest responsibility was not war or conquest, but ensuring the river rose correctly. A good flood proved the gods favored him. A failed one suggested cosmic disorder. That is why temples rose beside canals, why rituals accompanied measurements, why prayer and engineering were never separate acts. When the Nile flooded, priests sang. When it receded, farmers planted. When it failed, everyone prayed harder and worked smarter. Death itself followed the river's logic. The Egyptians did not fear it the way others did. They had watched fields die and return every year. They knew endings were temporary. Tombs were built like riverbanks, carefully aligned, measured, prepared for eternity. The dead were buried facing the Nile, believing the soul would journey west as the sun did, then return renewed. The afterlife was not an escape, it was continuation. Even the gods reflected the river's character. Hapi, lord of the Nile, was neither male nor female, young nor old. He embodied abundance, fertility, and excess, all held in careful balance. His body was round, his smile calm, a god of nourishment, not thunder. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell around Egypt, but the river endured. Invaders came with swords and banners, believing power could be seized. They learned quickly that without the Nile, power meant nothing. The Persians taxed it, the Greeks studied it, the Romans tried to control it. None truly succeeded. Because the Nile was never owned, it was negotiated with. Every canal dug was a conversation, every embankment a compromise. Egypt thrived not because it dominated nature, but because it listened. And that is the quiet truth hidden beneath the monuments. The pyramids were not the greatest achievement of ancient Egypt. They were symbols, impressive, permanent, silent. The real miracle happened every year in silence. When brown water spread across dry land, when black silt kissed the earth, when life returned on schedule. Civilization did not begin with kings or gods or wars. It began when humans learned to wait, measure, cooperate, and trust a rhythm larger than themselves. The Nile taught them that. And long after pharaohs became dust, after temples crumbled and names faded, the river kept flowing, patient, indifferent, eternal. Still rising,
still falling, still shaping the fate of those who dared to live by its banks.
To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was not a river. It was a living god. Its floods were divine moods. Its currents were sacred speech. They called it Hapi, the bringer of abundance, the lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose body flowed through the veins of Egypt itself. Every drop of water was his blessing, every drought his silence. When the annual flood arrived, priests gathered at the riverbanks. They offered bread, beer, and flowers, setting them afloat to please Hapi and coax him into generosity. In the great temples of Thebes and Memphis, hymns were sung, not to kings or conquerors, but to the river that sustained them all. "You flood the fields," they chanted. "You give life to all that lives. You are the God of bread." The flood was not chaos, it was divine order in motion, proof that Maat, the universal balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or too low, it was a warning that harmony had been broken. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of Maat, carried the sacred duty of maintaining that balance. When the Nile failed, so did his legitimacy. The river was not just water, it was politics, theology, and prophecy woven together. Yet the Egyptians did not fear the Nile as others feared their gods. They revered it with familiarity, almost tenderness. Hapi was painted as neither fully male nor female, but both, round-bellied, fertile, generous, a symbol of abundance without violence, creation without conquest. Even death followed the river's logic. When the flood receded, it left behind rich black silt known as Kemet, the Black Land. From this word, Egypt took its ancient name. It was the difference between feast and famine, between civilization and sand. Festivals marked the inundation like the dawn of a new year. Children danced, farmers sang as they repaired their dikes. Priests announced the rising waters with drums and incense. For a few precious weeks, Egypt was united not by war or rulers, but by water. The Nile's rhythm was not merely agricultural, it was spiritual architecture. Each rise and fall was a heartbeat in the body of a god. And through that god, Egypt found immortality. Every summer, the floodwaters carried a silent gift, fine black silt drawn from distant southern mountains. To the Egyptians, this was not mud, it was the river's voice, the language of creation itself. A handful of Nile silt, smooth, dark, alive, was worth more than gold. It grew wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, everything that fed both body and empire. Oxen plowed the damp fields, seeds were scattered into gleaming mud. Within weeks, green life erupted from the earth, a miracle so regular it felt eternal. Scribes recorded flood levels and harvest yields. Patterns emerged. Low floods meant hunger. High floods meant surplus and stability. Over centuries, observation became science. Farmers learned to read the soil by touch alone, its color, its weight, its promise. Villages rose on higher ground. Fields stretched in narrow ribbons along the riverbanks. The green valley, trapped between deserts, shaped a civilization balanced perfectly between chaos and order. In a way, the flood wrote history. Temples were carved from stone, tombs from limestone, but Egypt's true foundation was mud, wet, black, eternal. Even their pigments came from the same silt that fed their crops. The Nile was not just feeding Egypt, it was painting it.
To manage this gift demanded precision. The Egyptians transformed worship into engineering. Canals spread from the delta to Nubia. Basin fields, vast rectangular enclosures filled in careful sequence. Water lingered, soaked, then drained onward. Controlled fertility and human imitation of the river's pulse. The shaduf, a simple counterweighted lever, allowed farmers to lift water by the hundreds of liters. Later came the sakia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, scooping endlessly in calm rhythm. No magic, only geometry, muscle, and patience. Priests measured flood levels using nilometers, stone shafts marked in cubits. From these readings came predictions of harvests, taxes, and stability. Religion, science, and politics met at the waterline. Egypt's greatest machinery was not bronze or stone, it was people, working in synchrony, guided by the rhythm's tempo. The true wonder was invisible, not pyramids, but balance. Empires rose and fell, names were forgotten, but the Nile continued. Greek engineers studied it, Roman surveyors copied it, medieval farmers reused its tools almost unchanged. Even modern engineers, studying satellite data and flow models, are heirs to those ancient surveyors who measured with ropes and stars. The Nile's lesson endured. Mastery of nature does not come through conquest, it comes through rhythm. The Egyptians treated the flood not as an enemy, but as a partner. Their success was not measured in expansion, but in continuity. Life flowing year after year, generation after generation. Every civilization dreams of eternity. Egypt achieved it, quietly, through water. The Nile still flows north, still leaves its mark in silt and shadow, still murmurs the same ancient promise. Follow my rhythm, and I will make you eternal.